Video game development is one hell of a tough racket. Developers can spend over half a decade working on their passion project only to send it out into the world and have it be soundly rejected by critics and players alike. Each of the following games flatlined upon launch, failing to make a positive impression with the masses and basically falling off the face of the earth within months, weeks, or perhaps even days. I'm Sai, this is WhatCulture, and these are 10 video games that were dead on arrival. Number 10, Babylon's Fall. Let's kick things off with a game which, despite receiving its fair share of pre-release hype, sank like a stone in near record time. Babylon's Fall marked Platinum Games' attempt to break into the live service arena with this co-op multiplayer action RPG, though even with the developer's acclaimed prior work, such as Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance and Nier Automata, and passionate fanbase, there was basically negative hype for this thing as release day approached. The visuals looked dated, nothing about the gameplay seemed remarkable, and that's precisely what critics said when they finally got their hands on it. The critical pannings only exacerbated the staggering indifference about the game, which peaked with less than 1,200 concurrent players on Steam, and in less than 2 months that figure permanently dropped below 100 players. Platinum Games stuck it out for 6 months before announcing they were cancelling support for a game that nobody was actually playing, and the servers were ultimately shut down less than a year after launch. And so, with this being an online-only experience, there's now no way for anybody to play Babylon's Fall, not that anyone was actually playing it when the servers were up, so not sure how much of a difference it would make. Number 9, Crash Team Rumble. Rather than have Crash Bandicoot 4 developer Toys for Bob hard at work on the next mainline Crash game, Activision instead made them develop a multiplayer party game spin-off that nobody asked for, called Crash Team Rumble. This competitive 4v4 strategic platformer reeked of cynical live service slop from the moment it was revealed. Not only was it following on from some pretty sketchy microtransactions added after the release of Crash Nitro Fueled, but Activision was selling this party game at full retail price. With so many quality free-to-play party games on the market, throwing down actual cash for one that looked this unremarkable was an unsurprisingly tough sell. And so Crash Team Rumble bombed at retail. Reviews weren't awful by any means, but they did criticise the lack of launch content and repetitive gameplay loop, both huge downers for a game that again asked for a fair amount of money. Even Crash's loyal fans couldn't be compelled to part with that money, as Crash Team Rumble ended with less PS5 players during release week than, wait for it, the PlayStation Plus release of a Peppa Pig game. Oh goodness. Less than 9 months after launch, Toys for Bob ended support for the game, though to their credit, the servers do still remain live at the time of speaking. Number 8, Brink. A bit of a deeper cut now with 2011's parkour-infused 8v8 multiplayer FPS Brink. The hype for this one was actually pretty big at the time, but the game, from Wolfenstein Enemy Territory developers Splash Damage, launched to so-so reviews, with critics dinging at shallow gameplay, while on release, players grew frustrated with consistent connection issues. Splash Damage attempted to pacify players by introducing a 4v4 multiplayer mode for those experiencing lag during 16 player matches, but the issues were only permanently remedied about 3 months later when the Agents of Change DLC was released. Despite significantly improving the game, the update was too little too late, as players had lost their patience and abandoned Brink long before that point. An unsurprising outcome considering how competitive the multiplayer FPS space was in the early 2010s. Brink's concurrent player count quickly settled down to around 100 and never recovered, though there are still a loyal 20 or 30 players who continue to play to this very day, so that's pretty cool. Number 7, Onrush. The case of Onrush is actually pretty damn tragic, because despite the multiplayer racer having some serious genre pedigree behind it and actually being really good, it just never caught on with the general public. Part of the problem might have been the game's unconventional hook. Far from a typical racer, Onrush was a team-based, objective-led vehicular combat experience where not a single game mode revolved around crossing the finish line first. Racing game fans know what they like, and it wasn't this. In fact, nobody really knew what this was, because Codemaster evidently struggled to convey Onrush's unique gameplay in its marketing, so it wasn't terribly surprising that the game failed to make a dent when it did launch. Which is a shame, because you hear all the time about people, reminiscing about Demolition Derby, and this is kind of in the same vein, so we need more of this. And despite the game releasing to positive reviews and earning itself a small but passionate legion of fans, Onrush vanished into the ether within a matter of weeks, though Codemasters did at least keep the servers running for well over 4 years, so That's nice of them. Number 6, Predator Hunting Grounds. On paper, Predator Hunting Grounds actually seemed like a pretty great idea, an asymmetrical 4v1 multiplayer game in which players either control a soldier or the Predator itself. Of all the multiplayer games based on horror IP released in recent years, this one had an especially strong chance of becoming a breakout hit, given the Predator's iconic appeal even outside of the horror realm and the franchise's general popularity at the time. But reviews were wildly mixed right out of the gate, citing the janky, unbalanced gameplay, outdated visuals, and frustrating downtime between matches. And though the Epic Games Store doesn't provide player data, the game's footprint on social media faded within a matter of weeks, leaving only the most diehard of fans still playing. And even when the game did finally launch on Steam a year later, it rarely rose above 300 concurrent players, which says it all really. IllFonic have continued to create some pretty solid 4v1 experiences since then, but unfortunately Predator was not one of them. Which is a shame because there's so much potential here, but Predator got lost in the shuffle of similar games and is regrettably one of the more forgettable 4v1 experiences. Number 5, Godfall. Speaking of forgettable, oh boy! The PlayStation 5's launch lineup was pretty slight as it was, but Godfall certainly didn't shift any additional units. This title was an always online fantasy action RPG with not a single thing in its visuals or gameplay to distinguish it from every other similarly themed video game. We joke these days about generic looking games being what AI would make, but in Godfall's case everything in its aesthetics and mechanics were so snoozily pedestrian that it actually felt true. Reviews weren't quite disastrous, but they were hardly glowing either, citing an abundance of bugs, grind-heavy gameplay, and general lack of long-term intrigue. And the always online requirement, despite the game categorically not being a live service title, didn't help it either. Godfall evaporated from the collective gamer consciousness amid a sea of more appealing PS5 titles that were coming, proving so thunderously generic as to be almost entirely forgotten. Despite developer Counterplay Games being among the many outfits hit with layoffs this year, Godfall servers are still surprisingly up, even with the Steam player count rarely rising above a few dozen. Number 4, Radical Heights. Careful not to cut yourself on the edge as we discuss the most boundary-pushing game of 2010, which was unceremoniously sloughed onto gaming platforms in 2018. Radical Heights was Boss Key Productions' follow-up to the fun but commercially unsuccessful hero shorter Lawbreakers, and marked a clear attempt by founder Cliff Bleszinski to elbow his way into the lucrative Battle Royale marketplace. Yet when the game was released in April 2018 in extreme early access, that's X with a hyphen, Treem, it was painfully clear that Radical Heights had been culled out as fast as possible in an attempt to cash in on the success of PUBG and Fortnite. The gameplay was extremely rough around the edges, and worst of all, it just wasn't fun to play, ensuring that it shed most of its already diminutive player base in barely a month. The worst was yet to come though. Just 34 days after Radical Heights launched, Bleszinski announced that Boss Key Productions had shut down due to the commercial failure of Lawbreakers and Radical Heights back to back. Tough and unforgiving though games development is, when a game whiffs as strongly of desperation as this one did, it never had a chance of turning around its company's fortunes. Sad. Number 3, Anthem. No game on this list was more aggressively hyped than Anthem, BioWare's always online live service action RPG, which was widely touted as the game that could finally dethrone Destiny in the loot-to-shooter space. Despite the obvious appeal of flying around in Iron Man-esque armoured suits with your pals and blowing up monsters, Anthem swiftly failed to deliver on its massive promise. Even if you could forgive the nothing burger of a story and short campaign, Anthem screwed up the most interesting thing of all, the feeling of flight. The game's tethering mechanic, which prevented players from flying too far away from their pals, proved infuriatingly restrictive, in turn preventing players from fully enjoying the thrill of flying around and kicking ass. Add to this brutal loading times, grind-heavy gameplay, and a lackluster post-game, it was clear why most players simply burned through the campaign in about 15 hours and then moved on to better games. A year after launch, long after most had put Anthem to the back of their minds, BioWare announced that they were hard at work on rebooting the game, though another year later, it was confirmed that all work on this had been scrapped. Surprisingly though, Anthem servers are still up well over 5 years after it first launched, so that's something. Number 2, the Culling 2. The pathetically monikered The Culling 2, a sequel to the well-received 2016 Battle Royale game, died a near instantaneous death upon launch, with critics and players alike raking it over the coals for its god-awful gameplay and low player count, making it a struggle to populate a 50-person match. IGN gave it a devastating 2 out of 10 score, and the player response was even more vitriolic, prompting developers of Viant Games to pull The Culling 2 from market and offer refunds to all players just 8 days after it launched. The developer issued a statement admitting, yes, that Culling 2 wasn't a worthy follow-up, but evidently they released it anyway to see if they could get away with it and turn a profit regardless. Viant then returned to supporting the original game, which was itself delisted in 2019 amid falling revenues. Today it lives on only as The Culling Origins, a watered-down revamp where players are limited to 10 free games per day before being asked to open their wallet to keep playing. Yikes. And number 1, Concord. Let's wrap this list up with a game that actually isn't even out at the time of speaking, Sony's new first-person hero shooter Concord, which, it's not going well, guys. Though first announced last year, Concord got its true coming out party in the summer 2024 PlayStation State of Play, which began with a quippy Guardians of the Galaxy-esque cutscene only to reveal itself to be a 5v5 hero shooter, and a rather generic one at that. Players were scathing in their criticism of the reveal, noting disappointment at Concord's boilerplate gameplay, the fact that it looks like an Overwatch clone, and that it's chasing the hero shooter trend more than a few years too late, while not being free to play as well. The internet has the collective opinion that the game is dead on arrival ahead of its late August launch, and given the lackluster nature of the reveal, it's tough to argue with the notion that Concord is indeed cooked. Short of the planned July beta miraculously swaying public opinion, Concord is almost certainly getting tossed on the growing pyre of live service flops within a matter of months, or maybe even weeks.